Okay, so it's about time. We've got a fair number of people, so I'll just start with the housekeeping stuff, and then I'm sure a few more people will arrive. We have about 40 or so registered, which is nice. So this is our third JSF-PCST webinar in the lead up to the PCST Tokyo in November, middle of November, 11th to 13th of November. And this time, the first one was like a general introduction in July. Then in September, we had an introduction to theme 1. And then this time, we're having an introduction to theme 2, which is science and society. So thank you, everyone, for joining us from everywhere. I think got a fairly broad audience today. If I can ask you to keep your cameras, your mics muted, you can put your cameras on and off or off as you prefer. And there should be a Q&A and a chat. So if you have any questions, maybe you can write them in the chat and then I'll pick them up from there. We're going to have a 15-minute or so Q&A at the end, but feel free to write in your questions anywhere, anytime in the chat. We'll be recording this and making the video available later online on our YouTube channel, but we'll be removing the Q&A section. Will just be the panel discussion portion. And I will just share with you some links in the chat in one block. So there's our YouTube channel and our mailing list. If you're not already a member, you can join our Google Groups mailing list. And also we usually have a short questionnaire at the end if you have a few seconds. It really only takes a few seconds to do some feedback. And just a quick update on Tokyo. So as I said before, I think last time as well, capacity, we're at capacity now, the 120 or so people, including speakers and organizers. Because of the fire regulations and everything, there's a limited number of places that we can offer. The waiting list now is closed, I'm afraid. So if you were on the waiting list, I'm very sorry, but it will not be possible to attend now. But we are looking forward to welcoming everyone on the 11th of November in Tokyo. And you can see our website for details about the program and other information. And I think you can still apply for the JSF working groups. Is that right, Thilina? Until tomorrow? I think tomorrow is the deadline. Or Danny?
Workshops.
Yes. The Eureka Alert and yeah. So there's a few on the Thursday after the PCST conference. There's also a few extra workshops organized by JSF and the Eureka Alert user group. So if you're in Tokyo and like to join that, you're welcome to. Okay, so that's all of the details. And as we get started, so as I said, today it's theme 2, Science and Society. And thank you very much, Siddarth and Amane for joining us, and Thilina, of course. Unfortunately, Ayumi can't make it today, but I'm sure we'll manage somehow. So can I ask our speakers to give a very short introduction, just 30 seconds or so, to themselves? Siddarth, would you like to start us off? Just a very quick self-introduction. Oh, we can't hear you. Sorry, we can't hear you. No, sorry, no sound. Sorry, I should have checked this beforehand, before we started. My apologies. No, sorry, nothing. Do you want to try leaving and coming back in again? In the meantime, Amane, would you like to do a quick self-intro?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Amane Koizumi from the Japan Advanced Institute of Science Technology. Actually, I took this job, Vice President of the JAIST, and I took this job from since this April. No, oh yeah, that's right. 6 months or something like that. Before that, I was in the National Institute of National Science in Japan, and I worked for science communication and corporate strategy and everything. Now I'm also working for corporate strategy for university. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Thilina, quick few words.
Sure. Hi, I should add, Amane has been a long-term advocate for science communication in Japan. So we are so glad to have you in this webinar. Hi, everyone. My name is Thilina, and together with Yuan, I'm also part of the Japan SciComm Forum. So we have a small organizing committee, but of course, there's a lot of other people supporting from advisory group and so on. And I work at the Earth Life Science Institute, where we are focused on astrobiology and origin of life. And I'm focused on the science and society aspect of these two topics. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And Siddarth, do we have sound?
Hi. Can you hear me
great.
now? Okay.
Wonderful,
Great.
yes.
Wonderful. I felt very voiceless for a second there, but glad to be back. Thank you so much for inviting me. Hi, everyone. I'm Siddarth Kankaria. I'm an independent consultant in Science, Society, and Justice. I'm based out of India in Bangalore. And I work across the continuum of research, practice, and teaching in a lot of disciplines, including science communication, social justice, decolonization, education, and so on and so forth. And I'm really, my work mostly involves helping individuals and institutions reimagine SciComm as a civic, reflexive, and pluralistic practice. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great. Okay, so before we go straight into the questions of the topic, can I just ask Thilina to give a very, very short overview of JSF and PCST? Maybe we have some people who are not aware of the background. So JSF, I think, is a community of communicators in Japan. PCST is more of an international network. Can you give us a 60-second intro there?
Sure. So JSF has been running for about 7 years, and in Japan there are other science communication groups as well, like focus on different areas and different needs. And JSF is sort of focused on science communication in English language in Japan, which is actually quite important for a lot of universities, institutions, governments, and also at individual level, like doing research and practice and so on. And so there was this need, and that's why JSF created. And PCST is a larger sort of a group globally. And I would say it's both the individuals, but committees and groups, but also PCST is sort of like that umbrella that helps regional, local networks like these, and doing like PCST symposium and bringing the conferences or doing other projects and collaborations together. So I think I would highly recommend anyone watching to be part of both of them. You can get membership and join all the activities coming up.
Great, thank you. And then for the PCST symposium in conference in Tokyo in November, we have two themes. So the first theme that we covered before was education and training, and this time it's science and society. And each of those are split into two working groups. So we have 4 working groups in total that are preparing for the conference, and there will be, I believe, a position paper topic published after the conference. So can you give us, Thilina, can you also give us a very brief overview of theme 2 then, science and society, and the 2 working groups 3 and 4 that are kind of working in that area?
Yes, sure. So theme 2 of the symposium is focused on science and society, that what we'll discuss today. And we actually have this overarching question for the theme. How can we bridge the gap between the science communication research and practice to engage with diverse audiences? And the reason is actually most of our experiences, like individually and also as a community, and also like last 7 years, all the feedback we received, that we still have a big gap between how research is done and how practice is done. And so this is sort of an effort to have a bridge between these two and complement each other. And that also saves like a lot of resources and increased collaborations and so on. So under this theme, we will have 2 working groups. One is focused on cultural responsive engagement, which is where we do science communication activities, but thinking a bit more about our culture, like cultures in Asia, and which is at this symposium we are focusing on Asia, but of course this is relevant to any other region around the world. Like think about science communication a bit more culturally. And then the fourth working group is the research-driven practice and policy. And probably Amane is actually quite familiar with this topic, where we develop sort of like do research and then also practice together that influence certain policies. And I think this is sort of the way to do it, instead of like creating a policy and then trying to fill that practice and research. So I think there are different models to do it, but we are trying to sort of find ways like what would actually research and practice would, how that would influence research, the policy, because we also focus on real life experience, like lived experience. That's important.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, so from that, I think I should go to Siddarth first and ask. So your work is, in your introduction too, you mentioned you focus on decolonization and social justice, and in science communication as well. One of the things, as Thilina just explained for this conference, is looking at trying to find alternatives to Western models, or finding alternative localizations of science communication. What does it really mean to sort of adapt science communication to local cultural contexts rather than just importing Western models? Can you sort of give us some examples that help us to understand this concept a bit more?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. If I can just take a step back and also sort of reiterate or highlight why is it a problem to be importing global north models. Many of these global north models were developed in English-speaking, Eurocentric, Western context, global north context, and sometimes they and I think they're really great. They really work, and there's a lot we can learn from it. But it's also important to sort of highlight why they don't work within global south context. So sometimes these models are. So one of the things that I have realized in my work is that these models are often based on an implicit binary between public and science, and they always sort of categorize science and public at two different levels. And this implicit binary actually creates a lot of problems in terms of reaching audiences, right? And so similarly, often these models do not really acknowledge or talk about the role that science has had in the project of colonization, and how in our colonial legacies of science that persist today within scientific institutions, these models have not really been able to acknowledge that science is not always neutral, it's not always apolitical, and that there's a lot of role that science has also had in diminishing other ways of knowing, other ways of understanding the world in the history of colonization. So I think that with that sort of motivation for why it's important to look at local context, as you said, maybe I'll give you a concrete example. So in the 1960s and 70s, because I'm from India, I want to give an Indian example. We had something called the People's Science Movement. This was in the context that India was a newly independent country from British colonization, and there was a lot of developmental goals and urbanization that the country was prioritizing. But often this developmental goals, urbanization, the project of modernization came at the expense of ecological, environmental, and local communities' welfare, right? So there was something called the People Science Movement, where scientists, social reformers, activists went from villages to villages, from towns to town, and they did a lot of activism. And these were scientists who were also engaged in activism, where they were doing talks, they were doing debates, they were doing street art, street theater, public discussions. And these discussions were not from the point of communicating science from a pedestal, but they were really about engaging and activating people to think about how they can, benefit from the fruits of science, but also in a way that is balanced with the local ecology, with the local communities. And so I use this example because this was an example of science communication which was really, really embedded within the local context of what was happening in the country, in the region. And it also sort of galvanized a lot of people to speak up against science, not just for science, right? So a good science communication is not just about marketing science and telling that science is always useful. It's also about having a check and balance, and in the spirit of democracy, really being able to sort of balance scientific aspirations, modernization aspirations with ecological, community, tribal aspirations, right? So I think that's one example of science communication, which when adapted to the local context can really be useful, not just for society and for the environment and for the community, but also publicize science and the meaning of science and what it means to be scientifically engaged, right? So, as I like to say, it's about invoking the citizen in every scientist and the scientist in every citizen, right? So everybody is capable of engaging with science at their own level, and it's also about making scientists realize that they have civic and social responsibilities in addition to scientific ones. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you. That was incredibly concise and well explained. Thank you. So, Thilina, you've been working in Japan for some years now, both practicing and studying science communication, I think also teaching. Can you think of any sort of aspects of that we've just heard an example of how science communication in India is also about can also be about learning of the challenges and problems of science communication models, and getting people involved in the process of dealing with that. Are there any sort of particular aspects of science communication you think that sort of work a bit differently in Japan or in other Asian contexts in your experience?
Yes. And also just to give some context that I come from Sri Lanka, so having that, growing up in Sri Lanka and how we sort of culturally communicate, and then moving to Europe, which is wildly different way of communication, and then moving to Japan, which is a completely different level of communication. And what's interesting is that even myself didn't really recognize for a long period this communication difference in daily life, how that sort of relates to science communication. Because we have a little bit of tendency even in science that to separate science and our life as like these two different entities. And kind of also almost forget that all of these are done by humans, right? And so, and that's where sort of I was quite interested in looking into how certain ways of, not just in science communication, but in science, how we do certain level of interactions in science, and communication in science, and collaborations also. Because I have never really seen or experienced a country or a community that focus so much on collaboration like Japan. I think Japan has maybe being an island, there's this tendency to find collaboration and try to sort of build from like higher up, like university MOUs all the way to collaborations, and continuously, even if you go to any kind of scientific meeting or even a governmental meeting, you always see like the collaboration is important, that pushing for international collaboration. And one of the biggest problem is that when we do sort of these kind of push these ideas, we have to consider how culture comes into play. And I think that's one of the interesting things I learned in Japan, that trying to do in like science communication in English in Japan, thinking our society behaves in the same way, like how a Western community actually behave, like absorbing content and understanding content. And that's where it's really important to sort of see how do we communicate this research that had a collaboration between researchers in UK and researchers in Japan, but then we have two different sort of output that aligns with how people actually understand these. And so I think having these understanding that we are sort of built science communication, so like all the way up to now, from Western perspective, is probably the number one, I would say, that we need to recognize that. And then sort of find ways, how do we sort of move and build on top of these, a cultural framework, a cultural reflection, and so on to move forward. I think those are the sort of ways I would say this comparison that have taught me to move forward.
Yeah. So one thing then, so recognizing the fact that you're working within this model, that your thought is, your way of thinking is structured by these kinds of models, is kind of the first step, that self-awareness to understanding the difference. And then I think that also ties back a little bit to the first point that Siddarth also made about the binary. So for myself, as a researcher of gender and sexual minorities, I mean, the basic gender binary that we sort of construct our society around causes so many of the problems that we then deal with minority groups. So as minority groups. So if we could sort of step outside of that framework, then suddenly a lot of these problems sort of evaporate. But as Thilina says, I think self-awareness and knowing that you're within that situation is obviously the first most important step, and that's often quite difficult. Amane, if I can go to you then.
Yep. Yes.
So we just talked about sort of this awareness of being within Western models, the need to sort of move on and then find alternatives there. What's your feeling from a sort of a fairly high strategic position in a major Japanese organization? And as someone who's fairly central to a lot of the discussions that are going on around science communication in Japan, is there any kind of awareness of the fact that as a Japanese organization or in Japanese science communication, we need to find alternatives, that we need to find some kind of localized models for science communication? Or is it just a case of what happens at the university I'm at now at Nagoya University often is we just look, what's Harvard doing? What's Cambridge doing? Let's see what they're doing and then just go from there. Or is there sort of more thought put into this as to finding new Japanese ways of science communication?
It's I think in Japan, science communication for university perspective, domestic Japanese science communication and international science communication are a bit different. It's a different model, I think. It's Japanese science communication is for it's, as Thilina already said, it's a policy related. It's a kind of the government initiated and also government oriented, because it's some of you remember, but 10-15 years ago, Japanese government say, oh, if you get some Japanese national funding or something like that, every researcher should do science communication. So that is a mandatory. It's a mandatory. That is the context of it, because these researchers got the money from the taxpayers' money. So you should, return your, findings, this kind of knowledge, this kind of to the public, because you got the money from the taxpayers. So that is the context of the Japanese science communication in the 15 years ago that we had the Japanese government studied. But in that context, the university thinks, oh, okay, taxpayers' money, taxpayers, who pays the tax? That is the Japanese taxpayers. So, oh, we do not do any science communication. We should not do any science communication with international people, because international people do not pay Japanese government the tax. So, so that's why I said it's a different Japanese science communication. For university side perspective, Japanese domestic science communication and international science communication are different contexts. There's different basic. But international science communication these days is more and more important, because that is the reputation and the branding and the international reputation is something like that. So, for example, THE Times Higher Education World University Ranking, some of the universities going up this time. It's 1 month ago, and but some of your university is going down because of the reputation goes down. So, so that kind of the, how can I say, reputation and the branding, international reputation. Also, some universities focus on that kind of science communication important for, yeah. So anyway, what I want to say is the local domestic context and the international context are so different in Japanese science communication for university perspective.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. And also someone who works in that area in Japanese universities too. One of the things we're constantly told is the sort of idea of shakai kangen, of returning results to society. And so
Yeah, that's right.
because the taxpayer is paid, yes, that we need to focus on the domestic market. But now increasingly in the last few years, we've been there's been a lot more talk about rankings than there ever used to be. So this is going into reputation and sort of marketing issues and branding issues. It's a bit different to the topic today, but I think that's definitely an increasing thread in Japanese sort of international communications anyway. So if I can move on to some of the sort of challenges that we face in practice when we're sort of implementing science communication. Thilina, you are leading communications at ELSI, at Institute of Science Tokyo. Are there any, so Amane just explained that we have sort of different frameworks really for domestic and international communications in Japan. How do you experience that in any way at ELSI? And do you have any sort of come across any sort of challenges at reaching these different types of audience? Because obviously, when you say international, that's a huge range. That's everyone who's not in Japan, which is not one big morass. It's of course many, many, many different cultures and audiences.
Yeah, that's also an interesting point that how we prefer internationally means that everyone else. So I've been at ELSI for 7 years, and this I think over these years, I sort of personally have boiled down to 3 major challenges for us. And I think with the discussions we have among like ourselves and with other people who are working at universities here, we sort of share these things. And I don't have any answers or solutions for these, but these are, I think, fun. Even recognizing a challenge is still a sort of like one step taking further. So one of the main challenges is navigating between these 2 very different communication ecosystems. And one of the problems we have is that sometimes we don't even consider that these are 2 different ecosystems. We consider these are 2 different audience, which is vastly different from like understanding your audience but understand this is actually a whole different ecosystem. And because it boils down to how people think about content, how people think about navigating, and how do we think about what kind of science goes in and what's important to that society also, right? And anytime we have, for example, something related to an onsen, you can have really good research, but you cannot actually get that exciting for somebody from Sri Lanka because there's no onsen culture involved in it, right? And so you have to consider where this is, like which ecosystem you belong to. And so balancing these expectations like accuracy versus immediacy and hierarchy versus informality is sort of like a constant tension, I feel like. And so I think that ecosystem is a major challenge. And then another challenge is that English and Japanese audiences, like when we come down to audience, value context differently. So for example, like global audiences that society, we need like clarity, framing, sort of matter. And then in domestically, like credibility, institution tone is sort of very important. And so this sort of means that I'm quite opposed to translation. I think instead of translation, we need to think two different cultural narratives of the same science. And otherwise, if we are thinking of translation, that we are missing the narrative of how do we sort of communicate with the society. And then finally, I think probably all of us can relate to, and probably Amane can actually even feel this much more than me, that the structural challenges at universities, right, from government level, because researchers are also incredibly busy and may see, even if there are certain mandates, may see this level of communication as a secondary to science. And so even building a culture within the Institute of Communication is seen as a part of a good research practice is really important. And I'm sure if you go back to a science communication talk 20 years ago, somebody would say the same thing. So the problem is we still have that challenge 20 years later. So which is kind of mind-boggling. How can we not fix this? How can we not actually make it culturally change? Not policy. I mean, I'm not even talking about policies or like hierarchical changes, but creating that culture within an institution, within a community that you feel like this is important and this is part of actually the whole effort. I think those are sort of the three things I continuously find challenging, and I kind of categorize them.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, definitely the concept of when you're working in communications in Japanese organizations, particularly, the idea that international is not one block, that it's that the same method of communication is not going to work for Uzbekistan and Uganda and Uruguay. They're all going to require very, very different types of communication. It's this is something we always come up against. And then, of course, as you say, structural problems. I mean, researchers are very busy. I find that at this university, I spend maybe 50% of my time in meetings and committees, at least. And I mean, when do you actually engage in the footwork and communications? If I can, so Group 3 is going to be, working group 3 will be looking at this approaches to different cultural and linguistic contexts, and then rather than trying to find like a one size fits all kind of model. So that'll be the topic for the Group 3. I'd like to sort of jump on and go back to Siddarth if I can. So talking now about working group 4, which is more on research-driven practice. So Thilina just sort of outlined a few challenges, sort of structural challenges that we have. So based on your consulting work, when institutions want to make an improvement, try and get over some of these challenges, what sort of actually prevents them from doing that? What gets in the way? And maybe also you can tell us a little bit about the challenges that institutions in India also face, perhaps as sort of a preface to that.
Right. Surprisingly, I feel institutions face similar challenges across the world, and even though I don't want to diminish the importance of context and localization. Okay, so going on to your question, I think the kind of challenges that universities and institutions face, on the face of it, might seem technical, that they're not aware of newer, better, more participatory approaches. But I think that's just scratching the surface, and there are much more deep-rooted challenges that I feel, including cultural, systemic, structural, epistemic challenges, right? So let me give you a few examples. So I think one of the biggest challenges that I have seen in my work working with institutions and university is the lack of reflexivity, that they're really thinking about public engagement or science communication from only a point of visibility and not really value-driven work. So they're thinking of it more as marketing and PR rather than really doing the work to engage with different kinds of public, right? And I think that, as Thilina also pointed out, is a very implicit tension in the work that most institutions work with. Are we doing public engagement? Are we going after visibility? Or are we really engaging in value-driven work, right? Where we're engaging with communities by listening to them, by really understanding what they really want, right? The second challenge that I feel very quickly is the lack of evaluation impact measurement. There's a lot of science communication, public engagement that happens, and that happens for the sake of feeling good about it, and we pat ourselves on the back. And we don't really think about what has that really achieved. Has it really achieved what we set out to do? And there is no, going back to reflexivity, there's no sort of feedback loop which tells us that, okay, here's what we have done, here's what we think it achieved, here's what's missing, here's what we need to do next, right? If only we could follow that closed loop of feedback and reflection, I think a lot of the problems can be solved incrementally and gradually over time, but that does not happen partly because of structural problems, because of bureaucracy, because of hierarchies. But I think it's the lack of even measuring and not having data to tell you where you're going, right? And the third problem that I think is much more deep-rooted is the lack of epistemic humility, right? People really think that science is the only way of understanding the world, and that we are really experts, and they do not really have enough humility to listen to people who might have a better understanding of the context they're living in what they need, what would help them. And often institutions are the ones who set the mandate, the agenda, the actors, the initiatives, without really doing any consulting with the communities who they are really designing these initiatives and interventions for. And I think it's this lack of epistemic humility, the ability to listen and the ability to really consult with people, to work with communities, that often sort of translate more downstream into problems where universities are not able to really translate all the efforts and the funding and the initiatives into impact and action and things that they really want to achieve, right? So I think the last thing that I want to say to conclude is that these communication efforts are really an index of institutional culture, and it's really about pushing for value-driven work and not just for visibility. I'm not saying visibility is not important, but I think the value has to be put back within alongside the visibility. That's really important. So yeah.
That's really fundamental. And actually thinking about it, I mean, on a day-to-day basis in universities, when we're talking about communications, and particularly when you're closer to the executive, to data, of course, is fundamental, and we try and get as much data as possible, but then often forgetting that behind these numbers there are people, and that our communications too, it's not just about getting the university name known or being further up in the rankings. It's also the real meaning of that returning to society that came up earlier for Japan is here, isn't it? It's in making those human connections and listening to those voices, incorporating that in the process of science. So if I can just go and focus a little bit on the measurement issue, which I know is a kind of minor part of that. Amane, I think you were involved in quite a lot of efforts for measuring scientific impact and research in Japan. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm working on the how to measure the research capability of universities, this kind of stuff. So traditionally, for example, THEs, the World University Ranking, is using quality and quantity of research, but these days much more focused on the social impact of these kind of stuff. So science communication, in that case, how to evaluate the science communication, university science communication. So how to contribute to the society, university contribute to the society, how to measure contribution to the society is very important. But still, no, fixed way to measure it. So we are counting in Japan. 10, 15 years ago, I don't know, this is not good or not, but Yuan-san and I and David introduced counting the UREC view count of this kind of stuff, and how many views of the article. So I introduced this kind of measurement to the government and ministry, and still ministry using that. Ministry using how many views UREC. It's this kind of stuff. So I don't know, but there's no answer yet. So, but the government, again, the Japanese domestic science communication from the university is, how to say, we are thinking of how the ministry of how the government thinks. So we need to persuade them our science communication more, quality is better, quantity is high, this kind of stuff. But I don't know. Still, we are wondering what kind of measurement is good or not.
Yeah. I think in the discussions that we've had here at the University in Nagoya, again, it's still, people are very much focused on output more than outcomes even. So how many press releases have you made? How many stories have you published?
That's right.
And then some focus on the impact of that. So how many people saw those things, but very, very little on the outcomes. How many people's lives were changed, or what? I mean, obviously that's something very hard to measure, but how to actually measure the social impact. And as you say, social impact now, I think in Japanese higher education is very much a keyword, right? We have the social impact grants that have been awarded in the last couple of years. There's very much a focus on how we can develop society to be ready for a multicultural future. I think this is very much a strong topic in Japanese higher education right now. But just to sort of wrap up on this sort of topic here for Working Group 4, Thilina, can you give us a sort of, going back to the first question I was going to ask you, tell us a little bit about your views on the current relationship between science communication, research and practice in Japan or more broadly, because obviously as science communicators, some of us do research on science communication and then some of us are doing the practice part of it, and there's always a bit of a tension there, I think. Can you sort of talk a little bit about that area?
Yes, and so I work between practice, research, and teaching, which I can't recommend anybody because it makes your life harder, mainly because there's no very cohesive connection between these all threes that you can work at a system that supports it. So you're constantly facing challenges. So I think in Japan, we have much more sort of output and impact, sort of looking at practice, because there's a lot of outreach efforts, exhibitions, and museum work, and so on. And then so much so like formal research traditions, and this kind of means also a lot of tacit knowledge and intuition, but very limited evidence-based evaluation or systematic reflections. And then there are separately really good like reports and policies and sort of agendas that come from the government. And these are really nicely written, because I think there are people who are in Japan capable of looking at science and society for the last, few decades, and also looking at next few decades. And this is also quite common in other countries, sort of the look, predict, and plan how future works. The problem is how do we sort of take lived experiences and current practices into these policies and research. And certain ways I feel like it's maybe changing, or either it's changing or maybe I'm in a bubble. Because initiatives like Japan Psychon Forum, trying to bring other collaborators into Japan and trying to expand, and then also one of our core goals is to move the conference around Japan, and that has been happening for last several years. So I think maybe we are going in the direction of science, combining that communicators, research, and policy, and teaching together. But in short, what I would like to sort of, especially for this topic and our whole idea of the symposium, is that that Asia doesn't really need to work on copying Western models, but rather either, we need to develop our own evidence-based, grounded in social context communication cultures. And either we build on top of it or sort of build a complete like a new framework that works in this context. I think that's sort of like the goal of this working group, and also build all the other working groups into the symposium.
Excellent, thank you. So we've got one question. So for Amane, could you share your thoughts on whether there's a particular model of science policy in Japan, or how science communicators can or should be involved in science communication and research, I guess? You mentioned already the sort of framework of the difference between domestic and international aspects, but can you sort of comment on that?
Oh yeah, that's right. Thank you very much, Okubo-san and Yoram. Thank you very much. It's yes, Japanese policymaking model is something like more centralized and coordinated by Ministry of Education, Science, Technology, and also this Cabinet Office. So domestic science communication is much more focused on how to involve in the decision-making process in the ministry and the decision-making process in Cabinet Office. So that is the university's science communication. So yeah, that's why universities more and more focus on, for example, Nobel Prize winner, this kind of stuff. Okay, because politicians and government people likes Nobel Prize, this kind of stuff. That's why the university focuses on more and more. Oh yeah, we got Nobel Prize. Hey, my university researchers friends is Nobel Prize leader. Friends is anyway. It's yeah, it's a Nobel Prize. We are university focused on the Nobel Prize because the politicians and ministry guy loves the Nobel Prize. So I don't know, that is good or not. But anyway, yeah, always should do much more on focus on the communication with the ministry and the science, ministry or cabinet office. But anyway, but I don't know. It's too much. It's we are universities now too much focusing on the communication with how can I say, Ministry of Education and Cabinet Office. For example, we did the public press release conference at the ministry conference meeting room or something like that. It's several months ago. And actually, major newspaper did not cover any coverage we didn't get. But our university side, the president, the vice president like me, is successful because we did it in the ministry. So no coverage. No, we don't care about that. No coverage, and then we don't care about it. Press release conference in the ministry, that is very important. So something like that. So yeah, that's the Japanese policy making and the Japanese policy style and the Japanese policy science policy model. I don't know, but I don't know. I don't think that is a good way, good or not. Yeah. Is it okay? Is it okay?
Yeah. So yeah, I think definitely in Japanese universities we feel a lot of though national universities, particularly now, are supposed to be independent. There's still very much everyone's keeping one eye on the ministry and making sure that our activities are sort of in keeping with what the ministry wants. But in terms of, I don't know about in terms of science policy particularly, but one thing I feel working in a national university is that rather than trying, as you say, rather than trying to sort of do something new or to change things, the universities are very much focused on what the ministry wants. But I sometimes find in some areas the Ministry of Education seems more advanced and interested in change than the universities themselves. It seems sometimes that the universities aren't quite keeping up. There's kind of sort of institutional inertia that prevents them from changing and matching up to the policies that are being put out. Siddarth, can I ask you also from an Indian perspective, do you have this kind of, I guess this is kind of a tension between Central Ministry of Education and universities. What's the sort of structure in India?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. Actually, I was involved in developing a national science communication policy in the Indian context. So I do have some experience in this. There is a lot of inertia and tension between institutional actors and individual actors like me. But I do want to sort of highlight one important thing which I felt was that which is important to clarify is the function and role of science communication in society, especially from a policy perspective, is that science communication is often thought of as something that is more downstream of scientific knowledge production. And what I would like to challenge is that science communication itself is a site of knowledge production, where when you are brokering knowledge, when you are translating knowledge, when you are engaging with different kinds of people with different experiences, values, knowledge systems, you are in fact creating a lot of new knowledge, right? And often this intersection or this interaction of science with society can feed back into science to lead to new hypotheses, new questions, new ways of looking at the world, new ways of answering scientific questions, right? So I really want to challenge the upstream and downstream notion of science and science communication. And when we are trying to make policies, and this is something we've tried to push for, is that science communication is more independent and more deeper in terms of function and purpose than just sort of peddling science to society, right? Or translating science to society, right? So that's one fundamental assumption I want to challenge. And the second thing that I think Thilina also mentioned in terms of navigating this divide between research, practice, and teaching, it is difficult. There are structural issues, there are hierarchical issues, but I also feel there's a lot of cross-fertilization of insight that happens when you're working across these intersections or these boundaries. And this is also very similar when you're working at the boundary of science and society, right? There is a lot of cross-fertilization of ideas that happens. And I think people like us who are boundary spanners, who work between different kinds of worlds, different kinds of languages, different kinds of domains of knowledge and understanding the world, actually hold a lot of knowledge and understanding of how to navigate between these worlds, but we're also creating something which does not exist in isolation, right? And this is the same argument for why interdisciplinary knowledge system in science is now catching up speed, right? More and more science is more interdisciplinary, and these boundaries and these buckets of what is dissolving. And we need to, because the problems we are facing in terms of climate change, planetary health, misinformation are all interdisciplinary problems, right? So we also need to move towards less boundaries and more sort of bleeding into each other's domain. And that applies to science communication as well.
Thank you. That's a fantastic point. I mean, in a very limited and simple way, I've noticed a similar thing in working just as a communicator in Japan, that often science communication is seen just as a practice as opposed to some kind of realm of knowledge. And so often, and also it's seen as like the downstream end of the process. So like someone does research, they produce a paper, it's published, and then they come and say, hey, do a press release for me. So it's what you said is a much more detailed and deeper than what I'm saying right now. But I think within Japan, one of the big issues we have is that the lack of seeing science communication as a professional discipline, as a professional role or function that really can enrich the science itself, as you say, and also lead to many new ways of doing science and understanding our impact on society. And if we're going to follow this idea of social impact to the end, then we should be thinking, okay, what, not just the science itself, but the communications and how we explain that to people and how we involve people in the process of doing that science is absolutely essential. We have one more question from Anne. What extent does thinking of a local model for science communication also mean rethinking the roles for researchers and how they are assessed, e.g. with the rankings? How is that seen in a Japanese context? So, for example, consider the San Francisco DORA declaration that research should be assessed on more than their scientific outcome and impact only. Who would like to take this?
I can also provide some input on this.
Yeah.
So I think this is a really interesting question, and because our faculty is also evaluated annually, and I think if we are thinking about local models for science communication or any kind of like engagement, it absolutely means rethinking the roles and assessment of faculty, like researchers, because these traditional metrics of academic success like publications, citations, and funding rarely captures the value of the whole scope, right? And we are also kind of doing a discharge to the scientific community by not including that. I would say that we need to sort of redefine what counts as scientific excellence. I think when we sort of change that, what counts as scientific excellence, to include these other engagement and communication model in it, and then sort of we have a better sort of a bit more cohesive, inclusive scientific community. And that this also aligns with what I mentioned earlier about this changing of culture in research communities, institutions. So I think these needs to probably go hand in hand, not just science communication community trying to keep knocking doors, but ideally, has to sort of also understand from like top down institution levels and then science communication. But in order to do that, we also need some evidence that actually this works. So this is why that connection with practice and research is so important to show somebody. This is not just about counting the number of press releases, number of media, and so on. What's the actual societal impact? How do you measure it? So we do need the evidence, and that's why it's so crucial to bring the practice and research together to find this evidence, to bring it to the necessary agencies.
Thank you. Right, we're coming to the end of our time. Siddarth, can I ask you in 30 seconds or maybe 40 to respond to that question too?
Right. I think Thilina covered most of it. I also deeply believe that research and practice and teaching really need to work hand in hand. Because if you think about it, you can't really design culturally responsive engagement without thinking about research more reflexively, and doing evidence-based research does not make any sense if it's not culturally rooted and locally respondent to what's happening in the local culture, right? So I think it's very important to think of these things as interdependent and to learn from each other and be open to listening. And I think that's the most important thing, is that we can all listen to each other a little bit better. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I think that was an excellent point to close on. If that's okay, Amane, sorry, I think we're running out of time, so I'd like to stop there. Yeah. Just quickly before we close, there are a couple of PCST events coming up. Dubai in 2026, Berlin in 2026 or later in the year, Shanghai in 2027. I'd like to thank Amane, Thilina, and Siddarth for fantastic contributions. Thank you very much for joining us. And the next JSF Social, these online webinars, will be announced on the mailing list, so it'll be after the symposium in a couple of weeks. And thank you also to all of our audience for joining us and for your questions. That was a great help and much appreciated. And so I think, and there's a quick questionnaire there. If you could please give us some feedback, that would be a great help. It only takes a few seconds. It's just a couple of multiple choice questions. Okay, so thank you all again, and see you all in Tokyo, I hope.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.